To another recommendation here, combining two things I like a lot: manga and H.P. Lovecraft. So this is the artist Gu Tanabe, I guess I'm probably mispronouncing it. It was put out by Dark Horse a couple of years ago, and it adapts three of Lovecraft's earlier stories, his earlier period, his pre-Call of Cthulhu period, as Lovecraft fans would call it. And you have these here, and it's interesting how he adapts them, and they mention when they were written, and you can see the gap between when they're written and when they're published, because this is the old days of sending letters and manuscripts to people. You don't have internets, you don't have computers. Things take a while. He finally got paid in 1925 for something he wrote in 1920. Now, all these three stories are his early stuff. Two of them from Weird Tales, and one of them from the amateur press stuff he would do, which was basically published on a mimeograph. So the temple, for some reason, the Japanese artist makes it World War II instead of World War I when the story took place. And he probably does it for the Japanese. There's certain cultural things that are going to be difficult to get across. The temple is Lovecraft's anti-German story. Oh boy. Well, I'll get into that in a little later. But the Japanese are familiar with this aesthetic. But the World War I story was interesting to me because it showed the rivalry amongst the different Germans. Because remember, Germany was a country that was united from kingdoms. So you had the different kind of Germans, and the leader is a Prussian, the dominant German class of the old, of the old Germany, of the Imperial Germany. And one thing right off the bat, this artist, and it's black and white artists in general have to do this, but manga is like they're masters at this, is this chiaroscuro, this use of shadows and black. That's a lot of ink. In the end, it's like you're carving a sculpture out of paper, the white with the black. And when you're not using color, like most Japanese comics are not, you have to really have this stuff down. It's an art form in and of itself. And this artist really is a master of it. And it's like a gothic style, you'd say. And it's very relevant. It's very good for Lovecraft adaptations. So, story, I'm not going to really review the stories too much other than set them up a little bit. I want you to read them. I want you to read this guy's work and then look at the comic. But they find a pendant on a dead sailor of a ship they sunk, and then things start to happen. The Lovecraft slow build up, the dread slowly rising of something is not right, and it just gets worse and worse. And really good. I mean, people say, "Oh, his style is difficult." If you think his style is difficult, then I don't know what to tell you. It's a great style. It's fun to read. It's not the modern style. And the driven commander is actually someone you can respect because he's single-minded, and things get worse. They start to sink. The power is going out, the batteries are running out, the darkness is increasing, the oxygen is starting to go, but he will not give up. And eventually, look at that. That's all ink. Amazing. Amazing. And the other theme of Lovecraft, it's a little hard to review this, like I said, like this, so I'm going to have to do this one-handed. You get to see my finger. And you get this, and this is the other Lovecraft theme. Actually, the main theme, the main backdrop of his stuff, even his early stuff, is that humanity is just a blip in time. There's older civilizations, there's older beings that are so above us that we're barely ants or algae to them. And it makes all your struggles and all the millennia of this and that kind of negated, kind of meaningless. If you take it that way. Lovecraft was an interesting person in his views, and I'll get into that a little later too. But anyway, I don't want to give the story away. I like this scene where this guy contemplates this, and 9, he will not do it. He is going to go and see what is out there. And once again, right, So now we have The Hound. And this is actually one of my favorite stories of his. It's written in. It's very influenced by the decadent artists, if you know who they are. I'm a big fan of them. Most of them are French. The English-speaking person associated with it is Oscar Wilde, although I guess he was, he had a different name for it. The decadent term is like a made-up term. Some embraced it, and that's The Hound. That's how I envision The Hound. So this story came to, there's been a couple of adaptations of this story. This is the closest one to how I visualized it. So as you can see, this was written in 22. Focus. The year The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot came out, one of my favorite poets, and was published 2 years later. So he got paid later for it, and it's actually a very vicious little story written in that florid, decadent style. They even mention Oscar Wilde and Huysmans in the story, but the Japanese writer doesn't, because once again, it's a cultural thing. And you have these two dandies, these decadent dandies of the late 19th century, bored with life, with all the decadent things they do, all the color, all the art, and all the whatever they do in the dark, and they decide to get into the supernatural and grave robbing as a new thing, and they find the Necronomicon, and that's funny. That's the Necronomicon from Evil Dead. So the Japanese artist obviously is a horror fan, and he actually draws the Necronomicon like it was from Evil Dead, the book bound in human skin and inked in human blood from the Evil Dead 2, if you remember that. And they decide they're gonna go grave robbing. They're gonna go over the channel to Holland and dig up some old sorcerer alchemist graves. So you know where this is heading. And the art here is really, now we're in the woods, we're in the graveyards, we're not in the cold, sterile German U-boat anymore. And they basically dig this up, and they find a pendant. Okay, it's similar to the first story. They find that that pendant head. And then they start to hear howling at night, thinking they're scot-free, but then they start hearing howling at night, and then weird things at night. Shadows slowly building up, people breaking in, scratches, talons, look at this. And then the terror starts to build. Once again, these modern men for the time face an ancient evil. Look at that. And they're this is not going to end well. Look at that. Yes, my friend, you are about to die. So this goes to its conclusion. I'm not going to show you how it concludes. And then we go to this one here. This was one I had never heard of. And this was, hold on, The Nameless City. I never heard of this story. There's a lot of stuff he did. Very prolific writer. Some pseudonym stuff he did too with the women writers. This was published in the amateur press. So he never got paid for this story. This is like not self-published on him, but it was published on a mimeograph in the early 20s. So this is why it's one of his early works. And it's the same thing. You have this rational modern man, and he goes and he is exploring, and then he finds the ancient city, and the theme of Lovecraft is always there. The dread slowly builds. Meanwhile, there's nothing happening to this guy. It's the echoes of the past, realizing that humanity's time on this earth was recent, and there are other things used to live here. There's other things in the universe, and they look like things you wouldn't want to meet. They have fangs and tentacles and claws. And maybe humanity's lucky that they're not around, but are they not around? So the guy, you can say, well, it's boring. He's just walking around, but the horror slowly builds. And this is a rational man. They talk about history. You see, look at this. What are these drawings of something? What are they doing? Are these the original inhabitants of Earth? You don't know. And of course, all you care about is, are they going to come back? So, and that's pretty much the theme of Lovecraft here. And then you had the writer, 2014, doing this. So that was pretty good. I liked it, And the Japanese are very respectful of Lovecraft. Look at that. In the night, maybe that's a star vampire or something. Whatever it is, you don't want to run into it. And the Japanese are big fans of Lovecraft. His stuff was translated into Japanese, and they appreciate it. Why? There could be all kinds of reasons. The Faustian soul, the European soul, the Japanese soul tend to be very similar. And they mention here, yeah, they moved it from the original World War One setting. But like I said, this is recommended. If you want to see a really good channel, YouTube channel, probably the best one on Lovecraft, you got to check out Arkham Reporter. I think he's a South African guy or a Swiss guy. I'm not sure which. But he's really cool. He's chill. He's red-pilled, but he doesn't hammer you with it. And he defends Lovecraft. Defend Lovecraft. They should make a shirt of that because Lovecraft is now in for a lot of abuse by the same people that are messing up your comics and your video games and your culture in general. I'm going to say some things about Lovecraft that you probably won't hear too. I never heard anyone else say this. Lovecraft didn't write for everybody. Lovecraft didn't write for all people. If anything, Lovecraft wrote for himself and a few people in his literary circle. And, he would get paid for it eventually. He wasn't paid well. He obviously died poor. But the thing that I never hear mentioned with Lovecraft, with all the, at his own conventions, people are attacking him, because what can they produce? Their art, they can't, I think there might be some jealousy there, but that's the obvious thing. In Lovecraft's story, most of his abuse, ethnically, is for other Europeans. And I have to say this, okay? Whatever his feelings were of other people, a lot of the stuff that never gets mentioned is his disdain for other Europeans. What he thought of Italians, mimicking what the Italians who were brought into New England to work in the factories as cheap labor. His views on the Germans as these nefarious rivals of his beloved Britain. I mean, the guy was an Anglophile. He was one of those guys that was wished that America had never had the revolution. In other stories too, he doesn't think much of rural people, whether in the upstate region or in the South. In the stories, but he doesn't think much of them. I mean, that's just in the stories. The protagonist usually doesn't show much interest, and you could say, well, the protagonist represents Lovecraft. But Lovecraft was kind of making fun of himself a little bit. None of his protagonists were these learned white men. None of them ever end up good. Okay, so they never mention most of his disdain was for other Europeans. A, B, they never mention that his white supremacist male characters, they never end up good. Okay, if anything, the more primitive peoples that they disdain were actually right about the threat, showing who was the wise rationalist and who was the one that really knew what was going on. They don't end up well. If they're lucky, they end up in a straitjacket. If not, they end up eaten or ending their own lives. So there's a lot of nuance there. There's a lot of things being said. And if you know what Lovecraft was about, you would see that. He was a man, he was an atheist, he was a materialist, but he was also a traditionalist, which sounds like they don't meet. But that's what he was. He realized that you had to have some kind of marker, and he realized he was a man living out of time. None of these nuances are ever brought up by these modern people. They took his award, the World Fantasy Award, with his name, with his effigy, was taken away, which is good. It was an ugly thing. And now they just want to rip him apart and destroy him. They want to negate him, like a Matrix, because he wasn't a big fan of every single person on this planet. Well, what are they going to produce? They produce nothing. They negate. Lovecraft, his stories may have seemed nihilistic, but there was actually real humanity in them. There was a real sense of the human wonderment, the Faustian quality, the Spenglerian decline of the West, cyclical ideas. The stuff they're producing now, like Lovecraft Country, which was garbage. I actually read part of it. They're making a series out of it. And I'm worried about that when they make the Lovecraft Country series, because that's going to be the nail in the coffin for him in the mainstream. But not for us, because we're always going to have his stories. And he will rise again and laugh later.